Poor woman pretends to be ugly, but she doesn't know her blind date is a millionaire who's pretending to be poor. Sophie Martinez stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of the bakery's employee bathroom, her hands trembling as she applied the final touches to her disguise. The thick-rimmed glasses sat heavy on her nose, the lenses deliberately smudged to blur her striking green eyes. She'd spent 20 minutes perfecting the art of looking plain. No makeup to highlight her naturally full lips, her long chestnut hair twisted into a messy bun and hidden beneath a worn knit cap, her figure buried under layers of shapeless clothing. "You're insane," she whispered to herself, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd been hurt too many times to care about being called crazy. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face as she remembered the last time she'd been on a date. Marcus had been handsome, charming, everything she thought she wanted. But after 3 months of what she believed was real connection, she'd overheard him on the phone with his friend. "She's gorgeous, man, but that's about it. Once you get past the face, there's nothing interesting there. Just some bakery girl who reads too much." Those words had carved themselves into her heart like initials in tree bark. Permanent, painful, impossible to erase. Now, 6 months later, her best friend Mia had finally convinced her to try again. "Just one blind date," Mia had pleaded. "What's the worst that could happen?" Sophie had agreed, but only on her terms. If someone was going to fall for her, it would be for her mind, her humor, her soul, not for the genetic lottery she'd never asked to win. The alarm on her phone buzzed. 5 minutes until she was supposed to meet Alex Thompson at Cafe Luna, the little coffee shop nestled between two used bookstores on Maple Street. She'd chosen the location carefully, somewhere quiet, intimate, where conversations could flow and true connections could form. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Mia. "Remember, confidence is beautiful. Just be yourself." Sophie almost laughed. Be yourself. If only Mia knew she was about to be anyone but herself. She grabbed her oversized purse, deliberately choosing the most worn, practical bag she owned, and headed out into the crisp October evening. The walk to Cafe Luna took 12 minutes. 12 minutes of second-guessing and self-doubt that felt like hours. The cafe was exactly as she remembered. Warm yellow lights spilling from tall windows, the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls wafting onto the sidewalk, couples and students scattered across mismatched chairs and tables. It looked like the kind of place where real love stories began. Sophie pushed through the door, bells chiming softly overhead, and scanned the room. He wasn't here yet. Good. She needed a moment to compose herself, to slip fully into character. She ordered a chai latte, something warm and comforting, and chose a corner table where she could watch the door. Then she waited, nervously adjusting her glasses and rehearsing conversation starters in her head. The door chimed again at exactly 7:30. Sophie looked up and felt her breath catch in her throat. Alex Thompson was nothing like what she'd expected. Mia had described him as nice and stable, words that usually translated to boring in Sophie's experience. But the man walking through the door was anything but boring. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and warm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore faded jeans that fit him perfectly and a forest green hoodie that had seen better days. There was something rugged about him, something that suggested he worked with his hands, but also something gentle in the way he moved, careful not to bump into the other customers as he made his way to the counter. Sophie watched him order, black coffee, no sugar, and felt her heart do something complicated when he smiled at the barista. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made tiny lines appear at the corners. When he turned to scan the cafe, their eyes met. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs as she raised her hand in a small wave. This was it. No turning back now. "Sophie." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with just a hint of nervousness that made her feel slightly less alone in her anxiety. "That's me," she said, standing up and extending her hand. "You must be Alex." His handshake was firm but gentle, and she noticed the calluses on his palm. Someone who worked with his hands, just as she'd guessed. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "I have to admit, I'm a little nervous. It's been a while since I've done this." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was honesty there, vulnerability, maybe even a hint of the same guardedness she felt. "First blind date?" she asked, wrapping her hands around her mug for warmth. "First date in a long time," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, I've been focusing on work lately. You know how it is." Sophie nodded, though she noticed he hadn't mentioned what kind of work. "What do you do?" For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or discomfort. "I'm in technology. Computer stuff. Pretty boring, really." He took a sip of his coffee and changed the subject. "Mia tells me you work at a bakery?" "I do. Martinez Family Bakery on 5th Street. It's been in my family for 3 generations." She found herself relaxing despite the deception. Talking about the bakery always made her feel grounded. "I've been working there since I was 16, learning from my grandmother. She's the one who taught me that bread is like love. It takes time, patience, and the right ingredients." Alex leaned forward, genuinely interested. "That's beautiful. I've never thought about baking that way." "Most people don't," Sophie said, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. "They just see it as a job, but for me, it's about creating something that brings people together. Every morning, I watch people come in for their coffee and pastries, and for just a moment, they're part of something bigger than themselves." "You really love it," Alex observed, and there was something in his voice that made her think he understood what it meant to be passionate about work. "I do," she admitted. "Even when I'm exhausted. Even when the early mornings feel impossible. I love knowing that I'm carrying on something my great-grandmother started with nothing but flour and hope." They talked for 2 hours. Sophie learned that Alex was an only child, that he'd grown up in a small town in Oregon, that he loved hiking and had read every book in the science fiction section of his local library by the time he was 15. She told him about her Mexican heritage, about the way her grandmother's hands could shape dough like magic, about the poetry she wrote in secret during her lunch breaks. Neither of them mentioned money, status, or the kinds of superficial things that usually dominated first dates. Instead, they talked about books and dreams and the way rain sounded different on different kinds of roofs. "I should probably get going," Sophie said finally, glancing at her phone. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and she had to be at the bakery by 5:30 the next morning. "Of course," Alex said, but she could hear the disappointment in his voice. This was really nice. It was, Sophie agreed, and meant it. For the first time in months, she'd felt genuinely connected to someone. The irony wasn't lost on her that it was happening while she was pretending to be someone else. They walked out together, the October air crisp against their faces. Sophie's car was parked around the corner, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that she'd bought with her own savings and maintained with YouTube tutorials and stubbornness. "Can I walk you to your car?" Alex asked, and the old-fashioned courtesy of it made something warm bloom in her chest. "That would be nice," she said. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Alex spoke again. "I know this might sound forward, but would you like to do this again? Maybe dinner tomorrow night." Sophie's heart leaped, then immediately crashed as reality reasserted itself. She was falling for him. This kind, interesting man who thought she was someone completely different from who she really was. How could she say yes? How could she say no? "I'd like that," she heard herself say. "Great." His smile was radiant in the streetlight. "There's this little diner on Elm Street, Murphy's. Nothing fancy, but they make the best pie in the city." "Sounds perfect," Sophie said, though her mind was already racing with the logistics of maintaining her disguise for another evening. They reached her car, and Alex waited while she fumbled with her keys. "Sophie," he said, just as she was about to get in. "Yes. Thank you for tonight. For being so real. It's been a while since I've had a conversation like that." Sophie's heart clenched. Real. If only he knew. "Thank you too," she whispered, and meant it more than he could possibly understand. She drove home in a daze, her mind replaying every moment of the evening. The way he'd laughed at her stories about difficult customers. The way he'd listened, really listened, when she talked about her dreams of maybe opening her own bakery someday. The way he'd looked at her like she was fascinating, even buried under layers of deliberate plainness. But as she climbed the stairs to her small apartment above the flower shop, guilt began to creep in. She was deceiving him, just as surely as every man who'd ever been interested in her looks alone had deceived her. How was what she was doing any different? Sophie caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror and stopped. Even with the thick glasses and shapeless clothes, even with her hair hidden and her face bare, she could see the happiness in her eyes. For the first time in months, she looked alive. Maybe that was enough. she told herself. Maybe it was okay to have this, just for a little while. Maybe she could figure out how to tell him the truth without losing whatever they were building. But as she fell asleep that night, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a cliff, and tomorrow she'd have to choose between jumping and walking away. What she didn't know was that 3 miles across town, Alex Thompson was lying in his king-sized bed in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with the exact same demons. The only difference was that his deception involved hiding 8 figures in the bank instead of natural beauty, and his reasons for lying were just as complicated as hers. Both of them fell asleep thinking about brown eyes and honest laughter, completely unaware that they were both falling in love with a person who didn't exist. Sophie woke up at 4:30 a.m. to the sound of her neighbor's baby crying through the thin walls. She lay in bed for exactly 3 minutes, allowing herself to remember the way Alex had looked at her the night before the familiar weight of her double life settled back onto her shoulders. The bakery was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, filled only with the hum of the ovens and the soft sounds of her grandmother working at the marble counter. Abuela Elena was 83 years old and still insisted on coming in every morning to make the sweet Mexican pastries that had put Martinez family bakery on the map. "Mija," her grandmother said without looking up from the dough she was shaping, "you're glowing." Sophie paused in the middle of tying her apron. "What? Your date last night?" "It went well." It wasn't a question. Abuela Elena had an uncanny ability to read people, especially her granddaughter. "It was fine," Sophie said, but she could feel her cheeks warming. "Fine doesn't make a woman glow like a candle," Abuela Elena observed, finally looking up with eyes that had seen too much of the world to be fooled by deflection. "What's his name?" "Alex," Sophie admitted, beginning to measure flour for the day's bread. "He's nice." "Nice is good. Nice is better than handsome. Handsome fades, Mija. Nice grows stronger with time." Sophie concentrated on her measuring, but her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. If only she knew that Sophie had made sure Alex couldn't see handsome at all. The morning rush kept her busy until 9, when the flow of customers finally slowed enough for her to take a break. She was wiping down tables when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Good morning, Sophie. I hope you don't mind. I got your number from Mia. I wanted to say thank you again for last night. Looking forward to dinner. Alex." Sophie stared at the message, her heart doing that fluttery thing again. She'd given Mia permission to share her number, but seeing Alex's name on her phone made everything feel more real somehow. She was still formulating a response when Mia herself walked through the door, practically vibrating with curiosity. "Spill," Mia demanded, sliding into the booth by the window. "Everything. And don't leave out any details." Sophie brought over 2 cups of coffee and sank into the seat across from her best friend. "It was good," she said carefully. "Good? That's it. Sophie, you look like you've been hit by a truck full of happiness. What happened?" Sophie found herself telling Mia about the evening. The easy conversation, the way Alex had listened, the way he'd made her feel interesting and valued. She left out the part about her disguise. Let Mia assume she'd gone as herself. "He sounds wonderful," Mia said when Sophie finished. "I'm so glad you said yes. David and I have been friends with Alex for years, and he's one of the best men I know." Something in Mia's tone made Sophie pause. "How long have you known him?" "Oh, David went to Stanford with him. They were roommates freshman year." Mia waved her hand dismissively. "Alex is incredibly smart, but he's also kind. You know how rare that combination is." "Stanford." Sophie felt a small flutter of unease. Stanford wasn't exactly a community college. What did he study? "Computer science, I think. Then he got his MBA." Mia's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it. "Speak of the devil, David wants to know if Alex liked you." Apparently, he called this morning to ask if David knew any good restaurants that weren't too expensive. The unease grew stronger. "Too expensive? You know how it is with startup guys," Mia said, scrolling through her messages. "They're always watching their budget, especially when they're trying to get a company off the ground. Alex is working on some tech thing, but he's still in the early stages. David says he's been living pretty simply while he gets it figured out." Sophie nodded, but something didn't quite add up. The man she'd met last night hadn't seemed like someone struggling financially. There had been something in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that suggested he was used to being in control. "Anyway," Mia continued, "David suggested Murphy's Diner. Good food, reasonable prices, and the atmosphere is perfect for a second date. Sophie's phone buzzed again. Another text from Alex. I hope I'm not being too forward, but I can't stop thinking about our conversation last night. You're fascinating, Sophie Martinez. Fascinating. The word made her stomach flip, but not entirely in a good way. She was fascinating because she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. What would he think of the real her? I have to go, Sophie said, standing up quickly. I promised Abuela I'd help with the afternoon prep. Mia looked concerned. Are you okay? You seem anxious. I'm fine, Sophie lied. Just tired. Early morning, you know. But as Mia left and Sophie returned to work, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking deeper into a maze with no clear exit. Every text Alex sent, every smile he'd given her, every moment of connection they'd shared was built on a foundation of deception. The afternoon passed slowly. Sophie found herself checking her phone obsessively, torn between wanting to hear from Alex and dreading the continued complication of their growing connection. When closing time finally arrived, she was emotionally exhausted from the constant internal battle. She was locking up when her phone rang. Alex's name appeared on the screen, and her heart jumped. Hello, she answered, hating how breathless she sounded. Sophie, hi. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. No, it's fine. I just finished work. Good. I was wondering, would you mind if we changed our dinner plans slightly? I found this place that might be even better than Murphy's. It's called Rosalita's, and it's supposed to have incredible Mexican food. I thought you might appreciate the authentic cuisine, given your heritage. Sophie almost smiled despite her anxiety. Rosalita's was one of her favorite restaurants, a tiny family-owned place that reminded her of her childhood. I love Rosalita's, she said. Perfect. 7 o'clock. I'll be there. After they hung up, Sophie stood on the sidewalk outside the bakery, watching the evening crowd hurry past. Normal people, living normal lives, probably not one of them pretending to be someone completely different for a man they barely knew. She walked home slowly, her mind churning. Maybe she should call it off. Maybe she should text Alex right now and make up some excuse about being sick or having a family emergency. It would be easier, cleaner, less likely to end in heartbreak for both of them. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she could still hear the warmth in his voice when he'd said her name. She could still remember the way he'd looked at her when she talked about her family's bakery, like her passion for something so simple was the most beautiful thing in the world. Sophie caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror as she prepared for her shower. Without the glasses and shapeless clothes, she looked like herself again. Long dark hair, clear green eyes, the face that had been both a blessing and a curse her entire adult life. What if she went tonight as herself? What if she simply showed up looking the way she really looked and dealt with whatever happened? But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she couldn't do it. Not yet. She wasn't ready to find out if Alex was like all the others, if his interest would shift from her mind to her body, if he would stop listening to her words and start staring at her face. So she went through the ritual again. The thick glasses, the deliberate slovenliness, the careful art of making herself forgettable. But this time, as she looked at her reflection, she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt powerful. For the first time in her life, she was in control of how someone saw her. Alex was falling for her personality, her intelligence, her heart. Exactly what she'd always wanted. Maybe the deception was wrong, but the result was everything she'd dreamed of. Rosalita's was exactly as she remembered. Warm lighting, colorful tile work, and the scent of cumin and fresh tortillas filling the air. Alex was already seated at a corner table, and when he stood to greet her, Sophie felt that familiar flutter of attraction. You look lovely, he said, and she almost laughed. Lovely. In her shapeless cardigan and thick glasses, she looked anything but lovely. But the sincerity in his voice made her believe he meant it. Thank you, she said, settling into her chair. This place is wonderful. How did you find it? I did some research, Alex said, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. I wanted to find somewhere that would mean something to you. The thoughtfulness of it took her breath away. When was the last time someone had put that much effort into planning a date with her? They ordered, Alex getting the carne asada, Sophie choosing the mold chicken she'd been craving all week. As they waited for their food, the conversation flowed even more easily than it had the night before. Tell me about your family, Alex said, leaning forward with genuine interest. Sophie found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She told him about her parents, who died in a car accident when she was 19, leaving her to help run the bakery and take care of her grandmother. She talked about the weight of carrying on family traditions, about the way grief had shaped her into someone who valued authentic connections above all else. "I'm sorry," Alex said when she finished. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was," Sophie admitted. "But it also taught me that life is too short to waste time on things that don't matter. People who don't see you for who you really are." Alex was quiet for a moment, something complicated flickering across his features. "I understand that," he said finally. "More than you might think." There was something in his voice that made Sophie wonder what he meant, but before she could ask, their food arrived. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: books they'd read, movies they'd loved, places they wanted to travel. "I've always wanted to see the Northern Lights," Sophie said, taking a bite of her mole chicken. "There's something magical about the idea of all that beauty just dancing across the sky." "I've seen them," Alex said quietly. "I went to Iceland a few years ago, and it was indescribable. Like the sky was alive." Sophie stared at him. Iceland wasn't exactly a budget destination, especially not for someone who was supposedly watching his money while starting a tech company. "That must have been expensive," she said carefully. Something shuddered in Alex's expression. "I saved up for a long time," he said. "Sometimes you have to invest in experiences, you know?" It was a reasonable answer, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Still, she let it go. Everyone had financial secrets, and she certainly wasn't in a position to judge anyone for hiding the truth. They lingered over dinner, neither of them wanting the evening to end. When the check came, Alex insisted on paying, and Sophie noticed he left a generous tip without making a show of it. Another small kindness that made her heart clench. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" he asked as they left the restaurant. "There's a park nearby, and it's a beautiful night." Sophie nodded. Even though she knew she should go home, she'd put some distance between herself and this growing attachment. But the October air was crisp and clear, and Alex's presence beside her felt like the most natural thing in the world. Riverside Park was quiet at this hour, lit by old-fashioned street lamps that cast pools of golden light along the walking paths. They strolled slowly, their conversation ranging from the profound to the silly, and Sophie found herself laughing more than she had in months. "You have a beautiful laugh," Alex said suddenly, stopping under one of the street lamps. Sophie felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you. I mean it. It's genuine. I've heard a lot of fake laughter in my life, but yours is real." There was something in his voice that made Sophie look at him more carefully. "You sound like you speak from experience." Alex was quiet for a long moment, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I've learned to be careful about people's motivations," he said finally. "Sometimes people pretend to be interested in you when they're really interested in something else." Sophie's heart stopped. Did he know? Had he somehow figured out that she was deceiving him? "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nothing specific," Alex said quickly. "Just, in my experience, genuine people are rare. That's why I'm so drawn to you, Sophie. You're real in a way that most people aren't." Sophie wanted to cry, or confess, or run away. Instead, she smiled and nodded and hated herself a little more. They walked back to their cars in comfortable silence. But as they reached the parking lot, Alex turned to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sophie," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you agree to meet me? I mean, Mia could have set you up with anyone. Why take a chance on a blind date?" Sophie's mind raced. How could she explain without revealing too much? "I guess I was tired of meeting people who only saw the surface," she said finally. "I wanted to find someone who was interested in who I am, not just what I look like." Alex stared at her for a long moment, and Sophie had the strangest feeling that he was seeing straight through her carefully constructed disguise. "That's all I want too," he said quietly. "Someone who sees me, not just everything else." "Everything else?" But Alex just shook his head. "It's not important. What's important is this, us. Whatever this is." Sophie felt her heart break a little, because she knew exactly what he meant about wanting to be seen for who he really was, and she knew that neither of them was allowing that to happen. "I should go," she said, fumbling for her keys. "Early morning tomorrow." "Of course." Alex stepped closer, and for a moment, Sophie thought he might kiss her. Instead, he reached out and gently adjusted one of the bobby pins that had come loose from her hair. "Drive safely." Sophie made it halfway home before she had to pull over. She sat in her car on a quiet side street, her hands shaking as she tried to process what was happening to her. She was falling in love with Alex Thompson. Really, truly falling in love, in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. But the man she was falling for someone who didn't exist. And worse, she was beginning to suspect that Alex Thompson might not exist either. There had been too many small inconsistencies, too many moments when his carefully constructed persona had slipped. The easy way he'd talked about Iceland, the quality of his clothes, despite their deliberately casual appearance, the confidence in his voice when he'd mentioned being careful about people's motivations. Sophie sat in her car and wondered if she'd stumbled into something bigger than a simple blind date. But even as doubt crept in, she couldn't forget the way Alex had looked at her when she talked about her family, or the genuine warmth in his voice when he'd called her real. Maybe they were both pretending. Maybe they were both lying. But the connection between them felt more honest than anything she'd experienced in years. Sophie started her car and drove home, already planning what she would wear to hide herself tomorrow. Because despite everything, the guilt, the confusion, the growing certainty that this couldn't end well, she knew she wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Not when she was finally falling in love with someone who seemed to be falling in love with her mind. Even if neither of them knew who the other really was. Sophie had been awake since 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and trying to convince herself that she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. By the time her alarm went off at 4:30, she felt like she'd been hit by a truck, but there was something else underneath the exhaustion, a nervous energy that had been building for days. It had been a week since her second date with Alex, and they'd been texting constantly. Long, thoughtful messages that arrived at all hours. Alex would send her pictures of sunrises from his apartment window, and she'd respond with photos of the bread she was baking. He'd share articles about books he thought she'd like, and she'd send him poetry she'd written during her lunch breaks. The more they talked, the more Sophie felt like she was walking on a tightrope. Every conversation brought them closer together, but also made her deception feel heavier. She was getting to know Alex, the real Alex, she thought, and she was falling harder than she'd ever fallen for anyone. But she was also noticing things that didn't add up. Yesterday, he'd mentioned grabbing coffee at a place called Meridian, which Sophie knew was in the financial district, and charged $12 for a latte. When she'd asked about it, he'd quickly changed the subject. The day before, he'd referenced a book that hadn't been published yet, something about emerging technologies that was only available to industry insiders. Small things. Things that probably didn't mean anything. But they were accumulating in Sophie's mind like drops of water wearing away stone. The morning rush at the bakery was particularly brutal. It was Friday, and everyone wanted their weekend pastries. Sophie was running on autopilot, measuring and mixing and shaping dough, when Mia burst through the door looking flustered. "Thank God you're here," Mia said, rushing to the counter. "I need coffee and I need advice," in that order. Sophie poured her friend a large cup of their strongest blend. "What's wrong?" "It's David," Mia said, taking a grateful sip. "He's been acting weird all week. Secretive. Yesterday, I found him on the phone in his office with the door closed, and when I asked who he was talking to, he said it was work. But Sophie, it was 8 o'clock at night." Sophie's hands stilled on the cash register. Maybe it really was work. That's what I thought. But then I heard him mention Alex's name. And when he saw me listening, he got off the phone immediately. Mia leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "I think they're planning something. Maybe a surprise party. But my birthday isn't for months." A cold feeling settled in Sophie's stomach. "Did you hear anything else?" "Just something about keeping the story straight and making sure she doesn't find out." Mia frowned. "Do you think Alex is planning to surprise you with something? Maybe David is helping him." Sophie forced a smile. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." But after Mia left, Sophie couldn't concentrate on anything. She kept replaying the conversation, trying to find an innocent explanation for what Mia had overheard. Keeping the story straight. Making sure she doesn't find out. Find out what? Her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Hope you're having a good morning. I've been thinking about you." Sophie stared at the message, her heart pounding. She typed and deleted half a dozen responses before settling on. "You too. Looking forward to tonight." They were supposed to meet at 7 for dinner at a little Italian place Alex had suggested. Sophie had been looking forward to it all week, but now she felt like she was walking into a trap. The day dragged on forever. Sophie went through the motions of work, But her mind was elsewhere, turning over every conversation she'd had with Alex, looking for clues she might have missed. By closing time, she was wound tight with nervous energy. She went through her usual routine of transformation, but tonight felt different. As she applied the thick glasses and shapeless clothes, Sophie caught herself wondering if this would be the last time. Something was building toward a breaking point. She could feel it in her bones. Piccolo Italia was exactly the kind of place Sophie would have chosen herself. Small, family-owned, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh basil in the air. Alex was already there when she arrived, looking devastatingly handsome in a navy sweater that probably cost more than Sophie made in a week. "You look beautiful," he said, standing to kiss her cheek, and Sophie's heart clenched because she knew he was lying. She looked deliberately plain, and he was too kind to admit it. "Thank you," she said, settling into her chair. "This place is lovely. I thought you'd like it. The owner, Mrs. Petrov, makes everything from scratch. Reminds me of your grandmother's approach to baking." There it was again, that thoughtfulness that made Sophie's chest ache. Alex had clearly chosen this restaurant with her specifically in mind, and the gesture was so sweet it made her deception feel even worse. They ordered wine. A bottle of Chianti that Sophie suspected was more expensive than Alex was letting on, and fell into their usual easy conversation. But tonight, Sophie found herself watching Alex more carefully, looking for the tells she'd been missing. "How was your day?" she asked, twirling pasta around her fork. "Good. Busy. I had a meeting with some potential investors for my startup." Alex took a sip of wine, and Sophie noticed the slight tightness around his eyes. "It's challenging, trying to get funding for a new tech company, especially when you don't have much of a track record." Sophie nodded, but something felt off. The way Alex talked about his startup was vague, almost rehearsed. Most entrepreneurs she knew couldn't stop talking about their ideas, their plans, their vision for the future. But whenever she asked Alex for specifics, he deflected. "What kind of technology are you developing?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. "It's complicated," Alex said, glancing away. "Data management, mostly. Pretty boring stuff." Data management. Sophie wasn't a tech expert, but she'd read enough to know that was the kind of vague answer people gave when they didn't want to explain what they really did. "I'm sure it's not boring to you," she pressed gently. "You must be passionate about it to be risking everything on a startup." Alex was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against his wine glass. "Sometimes passion isn't enough," he said finally. "Sometimes you need other things. Connections. Money. Luck." There was something bitter in his voice that Sophie had never heard before. It made her wonder what had happened to him, what experiences had put that edge in his tone. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," she said. Alex looked up at her, and for just a moment, Sophie saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. "I've learned that the world can be cruel to people who don't fit into certain categories. People judge you based on things that have nothing to do with who you are." Sophie's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes people see what they want to see, and they miss the person underneath." Alex reached across the table and took her hand. "That's why I'm so grateful for you, Sophie. You see me, the real me." Sophie felt like she was going to be sick, because she didn't see the real him. She didn't even know who the real him was. And he didn't see the real her either. They were both living in a fantasy, and it was getting harder to breathe inside the lie. "Alex," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you ever feel like you're not being completely honest with someone you care about? Like you're protecting them from something, but you're not sure if you're doing the right thing?" Alex went very still. His hand tightened around hers, and Sophie saw something flicker across his face. Fear, maybe, or recognition. "Why do you ask?" His voice was carefully neutral. Sometimes I feel like we're both holding back. Like we're both afraid of something." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant continued to buzz around them, other couples laughing and talking, but Sophie felt like she and Alex were suspended in a bubble of tension. "Sophie," Alex said finally, "what if I told you that I haven't been completely honest about some things? What if there were parts of my life that I've been simplifying?" Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. "What kind of things?" Alex opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, his phone buzzed loudly on the table. He glanced at it, and his face went pale. "I'm sorry," he said, grabbing the phone. "I have to take this. It's important." He stepped away from the table, moving toward the restaurant's entrance. Sophie could see him through the window, pacing back and forth as he talked. His body language was tense, and even from a distance, she could tell the conversation was heated. Sophie sat alone at their table, her mind racing. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading and anticipating for weeks. Alex was about to tell her something that would change everything between them, and she still hadn't figured out how to tell him the truth about herself. When Alex returned 5 minutes later, he looked shaken. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting down heavily. "That was work. There's been a problem with one of our systems, and I need to go deal with it." "Now?" Sophie asked, unable to hide her disappointment. "I'm afraid so." Alex signaled for the check, and Sophie noticed he paid with a black credit card that definitely didn't belong to someone who was watching his expenses. "Can I make it up to you? Maybe we could meet tomorrow night? There's something I want to show you." Sophie nodded, even though every instinct was telling her to run. Of course. Alex walked her to her car, and this time, he did kiss her. It was gentle and sweet and desperate all at once. And when he pulled away, Sophie saw something in his eyes that looked like regret. "Sophie," he said, his hands still framing her face, "I need you to know that whatever happens, tonight meant everything to me. These past few weeks have meant everything to me." "Alex, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "Nothing's going on," he said quickly. I care about you. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. I don't want you to forget that." Sophie drove home in a daze, Alex's words echoing in her mind. Whatever happens, what was supposed to happen? And why did she feel like she was racing toward a cliff with no way to stop? She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice the car following her. It was only when she turned into her neighborhood and saw the same black sedan make the same turn that alarm bells started ringing in her head. Sophie took a deliberately circuitous route to her apartment, making several unnecessary turns. The sedan stayed with her for 3 blocks before finally turning off. By the time she parked, her hands were shaking. She was being paranoid, she told herself. Nobody was following her. She was letting her anxiety about the deception with Alex bleed into other areas of her life. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Thank you for understanding about tonight. Tomorrow I'll explain everything. I promise." Sophie stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "I'll be waiting." But as she got ready for bed, removing the glasses and shapeless clothes that had become her armor, Sophie wondered if she was ready for Alex's explanations. Because she had a growing suspicion that whatever Alex was hiding was bigger than a struggling startup and financial insecurity. And she had no idea how to tell him that she'd been hiding something just as big. Sophie fell asleep that night with Alex's words running through her mind. "You see me, the real me." But in her dreams, she was standing in front of a mirror that showed her a dozen different versions of herself, and she couldn't tell which one was real. Saturday morning brought rain and a text from Alex that made Sophie's stomach clench with anxiety. "Meet me at Riverside Park at 7 p.m. The bench by the old oak tree. There's something I need to tell you, and it can't wait any longer." Sophie read the message 3 times, each reading making her more nervous. The formal tone was so different from Alex's usual warmth, and the location, a public park instead of a cozy restaurant, suggested this conversation wasn't going to be pleasant. She spent the day in a fog of anxiety, going through the motions at the bakery while her mind spun with possibilities. Maybe Alex had figured out that she was deceiving him. Maybe he was going to end things before they got more complicated. Maybe the phone call last night had been from another woman. By 6 o'clock, Sophie was practically vibrating with nervous energy. She went through her usual transformation routine, but tonight her hands were shaking so badly she could barely apply her makeup. Or rather, her lack of makeup. The rain had stopped by the time she reached Riverside Park, but the air was still heavy with moisture and the smell of wet leaves. The park was nearly empty except for a few diehard joggers and dog walkers. Sophie found the bench Alex had mentioned, a weathered wooden seat positioned under the sprawling branches of an oak tree that had probably been there for a century. Alex was already waiting for her, and Sophie's heart lurched when she saw him. He looked different tonight, more serious, more formal. He was wearing a charcoal gray coat that fit him perfectly, and his hair was styled in a way that made him look older, more sophisticated. "Sophie," he said, standing as she approached. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. "Alex, you're making me nervous. What's going on?" Alex was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lake that reflected the park's old-fashioned street lamps. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I need to tell you something about myself," he said. "Something I should have told you from the beginning." Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. "Okay, my name is Alex Thompson, and I do work in technology. But I'm not a struggling entrepreneur trying to get a startup off the ground." He turned to look at her, and Sophie saw something like shame in his expression. "I'm the founder and CEO of Thompson Tech Solutions. We develop cloud-based security systems for Fortune 500 companies. Last year, we were acquired by Microsoft for $800 million. Sophie stared at him, the words not quite computing. $800 million. I'm wealthy, Sophie. Very wealthy. I have a penthouse apartment in downtown, a house in the Hamptons, more money than I could spend in several lifetimes." Alex's voice was flat, almost clinical. "And I've been lying to you about all of it." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sophie gripped the edge of the bench, trying to process what Alex was telling her. "Why?" "Because every woman I've ever dated has been more interested in my bank account than in me," Alex said bitterly. "I've had women pretend to love me for months, only to find out they were calculating how much they could get in a divorce settlement. I've been propositioned by gold diggers, social climbers, women who saw me as a ticket to a better life." Sophie felt sick. "So you lied to me. I wanted to know what it felt like to have someone care about me for who I am, not what I have." Alex reached for her hand, but Sophie pulled away. "Sophie, please. I know this is a shock, but you lied to me," Sophie repeated, her voice rising. "For weeks, Alex. You've been lying to me for weeks. I know, and I'm sorry. But Sophie, you have to understand. I have to understand." Sophie stood up, anger flooding through her. "You made me feel sorry for you. I worried about your finances. I suggested cheap restaurants because I thought you couldn't afford anything better. I felt guilty about my own situation because I thought you were struggling." Alex stood too, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sophie, please. Just listen to me." "Listen to what?" "More lies." Sophie's voice cracked. "How do I know anything you've told me is true? How do I know you're not still lying to me right now?" "Because I love you," Alex said desperately. "I love you, Sophie. That's the truth. That's the only thing that matters." Sophie felt like she'd been slapped. "You love me? You don't even know me." "I know you," Alex said fiercely. "I know you're kind and passionate and brilliant. I know you light up when you talk about your family's bakery. I know you write poetry in secret, and you cry at sad movies, and you put extra chocolate chips in the cookies for kids who look like they're having a bad day." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. "You know what I've shown you. You know the version of me that I've carefully constructed for you to see." Alex frowned. "What do you mean?" Sophie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You want to talk about deception, Alex? Let's talk about deception." She reached up and pulled off her thick glasses, then shook her hair free from the messy bun she'd twisted it into. She straightened her shoulders, letting her natural posture show instead of the deliberate slouch she'd been affecting. Alex's eyes went wide. "Sophie, what?" "My name is Sophie Martinez, and I do work at my family's bakery," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But I'm not the plain, unremarkable woman you think you've fallen in love with. I'm the woman that men have been objectifying and dismissing my entire adult life. I'm the woman who's been told she's beautiful but boring, gorgeous but shallow, a pretty face with nothing interesting to say." She reached into her purse and pulled out a compact mirror, using it to wipe away the concealer she'd used to dull her skin. Without the deliberately frumpy clothes and careful styling, Sophie looked like a completely different person. "I've been pretending to be plain because I wanted someone to fall in love with my mind, not my face," she continued. "I wanted to find a man who would listen to what I had to say instead of staring at my chest. I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I look like." Alex stared at her in shock. "Sophie, you're beautiful." "I know," she said simply. "And that's been my curse my entire life. Do you know what it's like to wonder if someone likes you for yourself or for your genetic lottery ticket? Do you know what it's like to have people assume you're stupid because you're pretty? Or to have men lose interest the moment they realize you have opinions and dreams and a brain?" Alex sank back onto the bench, running his hands through his hair. "I can't believe this." "Which part? That I've been lying to you, or that I'm not the person you thought I was?" "Both." "Neither." Alex looked up at her, his expression tormented. "Sophie, I don't care what you look like. I fell in love with your mind, your heart, your soul. That hasn't changed, hasn't it? Sophie challenged. Because you're looking at me differently now. I can see it in your eyes. Alex was quiet for a long moment, and Sophie knew she was right. She could see the shift in his expression, the way his gaze kept flickering over her face and body, the way he was processing this new version of her. I need some time to think, he said finally. Sophie nodded, her heart breaking. So do I. She turned to leave, but Alex called after her. Sophie, wait. This doesn't have to change anything between us. We both lied, but we both did it for the same reason. We both wanted to be loved for who we really are. Sophie turned back to face him. But that's just it, Alex. Who are we really? You're a millionaire pretending to be poor. I'm a beautiful woman pretending to be plain. We've both been so busy hiding from our real selves that I don't think either of us knows who we actually are anymore. I know who I am, Alex said quietly. I'm the man who's been falling in love with you for weeks. I'm the man who thinks you're brilliant and funny and kind. Your appearance doesn't change any of that, doesn't it? Sophie asked. Because I've heard those words before, Alex. I've heard men say they love me for my personality, right up until they reduce me to a pretty face they can show off to their friends. I'm not those men, Alex said desperately. Maybe not, Sophie said. But right now, I don't know how to tell the difference. She walked away then, leaving Alex sitting alone on the bench in the gathering darkness. Sophie made it to her car before the tears came in earnest, great gasping sobs that shook her entire body. She'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for, a man who'd fallen in love with her mind. But the revelation of their mutual deception had poisoned everything. How could they build a real relationship on a foundation of lies? How could they trust each other when they'd both proven they were willing to deceive someone they claimed to care about? Sophie drove home through blurred vision, her heart breaking with every mile. She'd thought she was protecting herself by hiding her appearance, but she'd only created a different kind of trap. Now she was in love with a man who might not exist, and he was in love with a woman who was both everything and nothing like who he thought she was. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sophie's phone buzzed with a text from Alex. I meant what I said. I love you, Sophie Martinez. All of you. The woman who hides her beauty and the woman who wears it like armor. Give me a chance to prove it. Sophie stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without responding. She wasn't ready for Alex's proof. She wasn't ready for anything except the familiar comfort of her own deception. But as she prepared for bed, removing the last traces of her disguise and looking at her real face in the mirror, Sophie wondered if she'd just walked away from the only man who'd ever really seen her. Even if he'd been lying about who he was the entire time. Sophie didn't go to work on Monday. For the first time in 5 years, she called in sick to the bakery, leaving her grandmother to handle the morning rush alone. She couldn't face the cheerful customers, the familiar routines, the questions about why she looked like she'd been crying for 3 days straight. Because she had been crying for 3 days straight. She spent Monday in her pajamas, alternating between staring at her phone and resolutely not checking the 17 missed calls and 43 text messages from Alex. She ordered takeout and let it sit untouched on her kitchen counter. She started a dozen different responses to his messages and deleted them all. By Tuesday, her grandmother showed up at her door. Mija, Abuela Elena said, pushing past Sophie into the small apartment. You look terrible. Thanks, Abuela. Really what I needed to hear right now. Don't get smart with me. Elena settled into Sophie's only armchair and fixed her granddaughter with a stern look. What happened with your young man? Sophie had been dreading this conversation, but she found herself telling her grandmother everything. The disguise, the deception, Alex's revelation about his wealth, the way everything had fallen apart in the space of 10 minutes. Elena listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When Sophie finished, her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. So, Elena said finally, you're both liars. Abuela, what? It's true. You lied. He lied. You're perfect for each other. Sophie stared at her grandmother in disbelief. That's not how it works, isn't it? Elena stood and walked to Sophie's kitchen, automatically beginning to tidy up. Let me tell you something about your grandfather. May he rest in peace. When I met him, he told me he was a successful businessman. You know what he really was? A janitor. He cleaned offices at night and was ashamed of it. Sophie had never heard this story before. What happened? I found out the truth after we'd been dating for 3 months. I was furious. I felt betrayed, deceived. Elena paused in her cleaning. But then I realized something. He'd lied because he was afraid I wouldn't love him if I knew the truth. And I'd been so focused on his honesty that I'd forgotten to ask myself the important question, which was, did I love him? Elena turned to face her granddaughter. The man I'd fallen in love with, was he real? His kindness was real. His sense of humor was real. His dedication to his family was real. The only thing that wasn't real was his job title. Sophie sank onto her couch. It's not the same thing, Abuela, isn't it? This Alex, the one you've been falling in love with, is he kind? Yes, but is he funny? Does he listen to you? Does he make you feel valued? Yes, but he lied about who he was. And so did you, Elena pointed out gently. You lied about what you looked like. He lied about what he owned. But the people you were when you were together, were those people real? Sophie thought about the hours she'd spent talking with Alex, the way he'd listened to her stories about the bakery, the way he'd remembered small details about her life and brought them up days later. She thought about how he'd made her laugh, how he'd been genuinely interested in her dreams and fears. I don't know, she said finally. I don't know how to separate the real from the fake anymore. Elena sat down beside her granddaughter and took her hands. Let me ask you something else. If you could go back to the beginning, knowing what you know now, would you still go on that first date? Sophie considered the question. Would she trade the past few weeks, the happiness, the connection, the feeling of being truly seen, to avoid the pain she was feeling now? I don't know, she whispered. Then you need to figure that out, Elena said. Because that young man has been calling the bakery every day since Sunday. He's desperate to talk to you. Sophie's heart lurched. He's been calling the bakery? Every morning. He sounds heartbroken, Mija. Whatever else he lied about, I don't think he was lying about loving you. After her grandmother left, Sophie spent the rest of Tuesday thinking about what Elena had said. She found herself going through her text messages from Alex, reading them with new eyes. Sophie, please talk to me. I know I hurt you, but I need you to know that nothing I felt for you was fake. I've been thinking about what you said, about not knowing who we really are. You're right, but I want to figure it out with you. I miss you. I miss your laugh, your stories, the way you make everything seem more interesting. I miss the woman I fell in love with, and I don't care what name she goes by or what she looks like. I'm not going to stop trying to reach you. What we had was real, Sophie. I know it was real because I've never felt anything like it before. Sophie read the messages until she'd memorized them, and slowly, something shifted inside her chest. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else, a recognition that maybe Elena was right. Maybe the person she'd been with Alex was more real than the person she'd been with anyone else. Wednesday morning, Sophie went back to work. She couldn't hide in her apartment forever, and the familiar routine of baking bread and serving customers was exactly what she needed to feel grounded again. But at 10 o'clock, the bells above the bakery door chimed, and Sophie looked up to see Alex walking in. He looked terrible. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he was wearing the same clothes she'd seen him in at the park. But when he saw her, his face lit up with such pure relief that Sophie felt her carefully constructed walls start to crumble. Sophie, he said, and her name sounded like a prayer in his voice. Alex. She was proud of how steady her voice sounded. What are you doing here? I needed to see you. To talk to you. He approached the counter slowly, like she was a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. Please, just 5 minutes. Sophie glanced around the bakery. There were only 2 customers, both absorbed in their newspapers and coffee. 5 minutes, she said. Alex nodded gratefully. I've been thinking about what you said, about not knowing who we really are. And you're right. I've been hiding behind my money for so long that I forgot who I was without it. Alex, please, let me finish. He took a deep breath. I want to tell you who I really am. Not the struggling entrepreneur, not the millionaire CEO, but the real me. Sophie crossed her arms, trying to maintain some distance, but she found herself leaning forward despite herself. I'm Alex Thompson, and I grew up in a trailer park in Oregon, he said. My dad left when I was 6, and my mom worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I was the kid who wore the same jeans to school every day and pretended I wasn't hungry when I couldn't afford lunch. Sophie's heart clenched, but she didn't interrupt. I got a scholarship to Stanford, and I felt like a fraud every day I was there. All these rich kids talking about their summer houses and their trust funds. And I was eating ramen for every meal and working in the dining hall to pay for textbooks. Alex's voice was raw with honesty. I built my company because I wanted to prove that I belonged in their world. I wanted to show everyone, including myself, that I was worth something. Alex, Sophie said softly, but he held up a hand. I made more money than I ever dreamed of, but I also learned that wealth is its own kind of prison. People see dollar signs when they look at me, not a person. Women date me for my bank account, not my personality. I've been so afraid of being used that I stopped letting anyone get close to me. He paused, running a hand through his hair. Until I met you. You were the first person in years who seemed to see me as just me. And I was so desperate to hold on to that feeling that I convinced myself the lie was justified. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. But you were using me too, Alex. You were using me to feel better about yourself. You're right, he said immediately. I was. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Sophie. I know I hurt you, and I know I broke your trust. But I need you to know that everything I felt for you was real. The person I was when I was with you. That was the most real I've been in years. Sophie stared at him, her heart pounding. How do I know that? How do I know you're not just telling me what you think I want to hear? Alex reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Because I want to show you something. He opened an app and turned the screen toward her. Sophie found herself looking at what appeared to be a bank account. Alex's bank account. The number at the top made her gasp. This is what I'm worth, Alex said quietly. Every penny. I'm showing you because I want you to know exactly who you'd be dealing with if you gave me another chance. Sophie pushed the phone away. I don't want to see that. Why not? Because it doesn't matter. The words came out before Sophie could stop them, and she realized they were true. It doesn't matter if you have $8 or $800 million. What matters is that you lied to me. And you lied to me too, Alex said gently. But Sophie, look at me. Really look at me. Do you see someone who's trying to deceive you? Or do you see someone who's terrified of losing the best thing that's ever happened to him? Sophie looked, really looked, and what she saw was a man who was completely, utterly vulnerable. His defenses were down, his masks were off, and he was standing in front of her offering his heart with no guarantee that she wouldn't destroy it. I see someone who's scared, she said finally. I am scared, Alex admitted. I'm terrified. Because I love you, Sophie Martinez. I love your passion for your family's bakery and your secret poetry and the way you light up when you talk about something you care about. I love your intelligence and your kindness and your strength. And yes, I love your beauty too, but that's not why I'm here. Then why are you here? Because I want to try again. I want to start over, with no lies between us. I want to introduce myself properly. Alex took a step back and extended his hand. Hi, I'm Alex Thompson. I'm a tech CEO who grew up poor and made more money than I know what to do with. I'm terrible at relationships because I have trust issues, but I'm willing to work on that. I love hiking and science fiction novels, and I cry at sad movies. I'm also completely, hopelessly in love with a woman named Sophie Martinez, and I'm hoping she'll give me a chance to prove that I'm worth the risk. Sophie stared at his outstretched hand, her mind racing. This was her moment of choice. She could walk away, protect herself, stick to the safe path she'd been walking for years. Or she could take the biggest risk of her life and trust that maybe, just maybe, real love was worth the possibility of real heartbreak. Sophie. Alex's voice was barely a whisper. Please. Sophie looked at his hand, then at his face, then back at his hand. And slowly, she reached out and took it. Hi, she said, her voice shaking. I'm Sophie Martinez. I work at my family's bakery, and I write poetry in secret. I'm beautiful, and I've spent my whole adult life wishing I wasn't because people can't see past my face to the person underneath. I'm also completely terrified of being hurt again, but I'm willing to take the risk if you are. Alex's smile was radiant. I'm willing to take the risk. Good, Sophie said, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Because I think I'm falling in love with you too. The real you, whoever that is. I guess we'll figure it out together, Alex said, and Sophie realized that maybe that was the most honest thing either of them had said in weeks. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be more conversations, more revelations, more chances to hurt each other. But as Sophie looked into Alex's eyes and saw her own hope reflected back at her, she thought maybe it was something better than a fairy tale. Maybe it was real. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.